Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the American generals and their on-air war games.
That's the message that has to get out to the American people.
The Pentagon operation that embedded the military within the U.S. media.
This is the best trained force we have ever had.
This is
watchdogs patrolling the web to keep the media honest.
Well, all we're doing is putting what you said on the web and showing people that it isn't true.
And CNN looking at a billion-dollar lawsuit over its coverage of China.
We're in hock to the Chinese up to our eyeballs because of the war in Iraq, for one thing.
Welcome back. This week we're taking a long look at the U.S. media and its reporting on the so-called War on Terror. We'll begin with the fallout over a New York Times story about a Pentagon public relations offensive that virtually embedded retired military men into the U.S. news media in order to sell the Bush administration's line on Iraq. The Pentagon shut down the program shortly after the Times published its story. But what about the news channels and newspapers that played along in this propaganda game? That's our starting point this week, the story of the Pentagon pundits and what it says about the relationship between the U.S. military and the people who report on it.
Are these retired military officials really just puppets of the Pentagon?
A better question might have been, were the media just puppets of the Pentagon?
Remember when it started and it was kind of a big deal that some journalists were embedded with the troops? Well, this is great. As it turns out, it was more of an exchange program because they actually also had troops embedded with the journalists.
Which would be funnier if this story wasn't so serious. As the New York Times reported in the paper and on its site, in April of 2006, when 6 U.S. retired generals were making news by criticizing the Pentagon's strategy in Iraq, the U.S. military launched a media counteroffensive.
You know, this is a 50-year war. There's not going to be any short-term solution to this.
The Times obtained minutes of meetings involving the then Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, his head of communications, Tory Clark, and another group of retired generals they summoned to Washington.
To the Pentagon, they were known as, quote, message force multipliers, surrogates who would reliably echo administration talking points as if they were their own views.
This is the best leadership our military has had.
Here's an example of one of the messages the retired officers were given by the Pentagon before they were sent into action on the U.S. airwaves.
In one of your speeches, you ought to say, everybody stop for a minute and imagine an Iraq ruled by Zarqawi.
The message needs to be, imagine an Iraq. Imagine Iraq under the control of Zarqawi. That's the message that has to get out to the American people.
It was obvious that they were not neutral and they were not independent. But what we learned from the New York Times is just how dependent these people were. 18 different briefings from Rumsfeld to these military analysts who were appearing on TV.
Any network that claims total innocence is in a state of denial. The networks have an obligation when they put an expert on the air, whether it's a financial expert, a military expert, whatever, to vet the expert to see whether or not that person might be compromised.
Well, they didn't fall for the misinformation. They jumped for it. They weren't dupes. They were willing accomplices in a system where the news media of the United States overly rely on official sources and serve as conveyor belts for misinformation coming from entities like the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon.
Appreciate you plugged in, and I want everybody to know, the General knows what he's talking about.
The Times story made a big splash at the Pentagon, which killed the pundits program, but it got very little coverage on the networks that put the military men on the air. PBS, a publicly funded channel, did the story, or at least tried to.
And for the record, we invited Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, and NBC to participate, but they declined our offer or did not respond.
The question is whether many of these analysts have been less independent.
CNN had a very short report on it, and it was biased. You see now that the Pentagon was releasing false information about Iran, and the networks were going for it hook, line, and sinker. Just like when they went for the White House deceptions about Iraq 5 years earlier.
Before it canceled the pundits program, the Pentagon told the New York Times it was no big deal. The intent and purpose of this, a spokesman said, is nothing other than an earnest attempt to inform the American people.
Well, it's their job to say that that's true. It's going to be a cold day in hell before the Pentagon officials stand up and say, well, yeah, part of our job is to lie to you. In point of fact, though, that is part of their job. It shouldn't be the job of journalists, though.
The truth is that retired military men were doing the Pentagon's bidding long before that meeting in 2006. All the U.S. networks had so-called analysts on their payrolls before the Iraq War even started. And some of those networks consulted with the Pentagon on who to use.
I went to the Pentagon myself several times before the war started, met with important people there and said, for instance at CNN, here are the generals we're thinking of retaining to advise us on the air and off about the war, and we got a big thumbs up on all of them. That was important.
So in effect, you have a supposedly independent network, in this case CNN, going to the U.S. military high command and saying, we are interested in hiring these individuals to work for CNN. Is it okay? And the whole notion of the separation between press and state goes down the tubes.
Here's how Eason Jordan, who has since left CNN, explains his consultations with the Pentagon.
We try to find the best qualified people we can. So in CNN's case, we also wanted to make sure the experts had access to decision makers in the Pentagon so they could be enlightened in their commentary. And when I say enlightened, it doesn't mean guided. It just means they're smart about what they're saying.
General Wayne Downing, General Montgomery Meigs, and Colonel Ken Howard.
The analysts were no longer in uniform, but many still held conflicts of interest. As the Times story detailed, it is common for former officers to go to work for military contractors who profit when America goes to war.
So they were not only dependent on the Pentagon for talking points and spin and propaganda points, they were actually dependent on saying the right things on television in order to keep the money, the military contracts coming into the corporations that they currently work for.
If we want to have full disclosure in this case, you would have something similar to what takes place with the racing sport in the United States. When a driver of a racing car has stitched into his uniform the various sponsors that he is working for. So if we're going to have these so-called military analysts on U.S. TV networks beating the drums for war, then perhaps when they're wearing their suits, you should have stitched into the fabric of their clothing Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, all these other huge military contractors, since that's really, in effect, who many of them are working for.
For all the criticism the Pentagon pundit story lays at the feet of big U.S. media, it's worth noting that the story did become public through that media. The New York Times, which has apologized for its own failings during the run-up to Iraq, spent 2 years working on this story and sued the Pentagon to get the relevant documents.
We should acknowledge that this sort of problem is not unique to the United States and the American government. One of the big differences is that the United States is pretentious about its freedom, and so the hypocrisy is larger. Another major difference is the United States has the most powerful military in the world and implements such horrific violence as has been the case in Iraq. But that fundamental question from Hong Kong to South Africa to Jordan to Washington, D.C. is still with us. To what extent are the news media being independent?
It's laughable. Okay.
Have the U.S. media learned their lesson? Well, when one considers that the PR woman behind the Pentagon Pundits program, Tori Clark, is now a paid on-air consultant for ABC News, the answer is probably not. Our Global Village Voices now with their take on the Pentagon Pundits.
I think this practice clearly has to stop. I don't blame the Pentagon for trying to spin people. That's the British Ministry of Defence does that. I do blame the networks for allowing this practice to continue and, in a sense, to falsify the picture. You see, either the generals get it right or the network's own correspondents get it right. When they're in conflict, one or other should be fired. And I suspect in this case, it should be the generals.
Nothing the Pentagon or this administration does really would surprise me at all. And the fact that a lot of these generals appear on Fox News is no surprise either, because listening to Fox News is like joining the Republican Party. I think Fox News covers the Iraq War as they cover really all of American politics, and that is in a way that's slanted towards the administration.
This is another black eye for the mainstream American news media, which has been played like an ood by the Bush administration. The media allowed itself to surrender to the military strategy of the war, embedding themselves basically as instruments of conflict rather than of truth. They gladly reported what they were told to report. Why should we now be surprised that an administration that lied to the public to justify the invasion of Iraq and co-opted the so-called free media would not then engage in more unethical behavior by planting individuals to pretend they were objective to help sell the administration's agenda?
We're always open to direct on-air feedback from our viewers on the state of the world's news media. Just email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net and we'll find a way through a webcam, even a camera phone, to get you on the air as one of our Global Village voices. Some quick hits from the world of media now. Listening Post News Bites. The Israeli government is reported to be close to a multi-million-dollar settlement with the family of a British filmmaker who was shot dead in Gaza 5 years ago. James Miller was killed by an Israeli bullet, and his story was posthumously told in the award-winning documentary Death in Gaza. The Israeli paper Haaretz reports that Israel's government has offered the family $3.5 million to settle the case. The family has already launched a civil case in an Israeli court, and the British government warned Israel at one stage it would seek to extradite the soldiers involved in Miller's shooting. And in another legal case, how do you put a price on a news network alleged to have slandered an entire country? Well, if it's China and the claim is for $1 per citizen, that adds up to $1.3 billion. That's how much money is being claimed in a lawsuit launched in New York against CNN after one of the network's commentators had this to say about China and the controversies over Tibet and the Olympic torch relay.
We're in hock to the Chinese up to our eyeballs because of the war in Iraq. For one thing, they're holding hundreds of billions of dollars worth of our paper. We also are running hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade deficits with them as we continue to import their junk with the lead paint on them and the poison pet food. I think they're basically the same bunch of goons and thugs they've been for the last 50 years.
The suit is being brought by two Chinese citizens, one of whom lives in New York. They claim the network, quote, intentionally caused mental harm, unquote, to the plaintiffs. A spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry said he hopes the network takes the case seriously, that the offending comments hurt CNN's image. Afghanistan's most popular private television station, Tolo TV, is defying a ruling by the Karzai government that bans Indian soap operas from being broadcast in Afghanistan. The Afghan Information and Culture Minister, Abdul Karim Quran, has sought to ban 5 shows which the country's top religious council has criticized as un-Islamic. However, Tolo, which airs 2 of the shows, has kept them on the air, saying the ruling has no basis in law, it's just the opinion of one minister. The broadcasts in question show Indian women, Hindus, unveiled, wearing saris that often expose the waist. News coverage of Myanmar, the country formerly known as Burma, has gone quiet, but there's still a story there. There's a referendum on a new constitution coming up May 10th. However, the media are only allowed to report on one side of the story. There was a big media clampdown last year when pro-democracy riots broke out in Myanmar. The military junta running the country wants citizens to vote yes in this referendum, and its critics say that all coverage of the no side of the argument has been forbidden. The press freedom group Reporters Without Borders argues that unless the media are allowed to do their work covering both sides of the debate, the referendum process cannot be seen as valid. We're back after the break with a story about some websites you might find interesting if you're looking for alternative reporting on U.S. politics.